Good morning and welcome to Writers Fix Problems. I'm Blaine Pardoe, best-selling and award-winning author, and today we're having on Jeffery Haskell. Jeffery, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Blaine, so much. I really appreciate being here. It's quite an honor.
We had a great pre-show. I wish we had taped that. Actually, it was a pretty good conversation. But
I love talking, so you're not going to have a problem getting me to say all that again.
Oh, no problem. Hey, it was really interesting because I met Jeffery through Facebook more than anything, and you meet a lot of authors, etc. And I do see recommendations for books pop up, and I always try to look at my fellow authors who have been nice and supportive of me, and I go, well, let's take a look at their books. And I saw this one, Against All Odds, pop up, and I was like, you know what, I need to dive into this. So what we'll do is I'm going to give you a quick review. Well, it's not even quick. It's a long review of your book. And then we'll talk a little bit about the book, the series, and your writing and all the other projects you're working on. So let's talk a little bit about Against All Odds. Now, there's a lot of good military sci-fi out there, a number of different series. The genre has several niches. There's ground combat, space combat, political space opera, etc. Personally, I tend to favor ground combat novels, but I am a big David Weber, Honor Harrington fan. So I decided to jump into Jeffery Haskell's Against All Odds as the first book of the Grimm's War series. The first chapter for me was a gut punch. You start out with this young, up-and-coming James T. Kirk-esque officer. In a brilliant feat of writing, Haskell introduces an almost insurmountable flaw to the character in the most dramatic fashion possible. I was hooked on it as soon as I finished the first chapter. I was like, wow, this is not going the direction I thought it was going to go. It isn't a hero that can do no wrong. And that's one of the things that's really endearing about the book. His career ends up in the proverbial toilet. He's given a ship, but it's a far cry from the flagship of the fleet. In fact, it's an old, tiny destroyer, one that doesn't even have its primary drive. Its captain is dead. The crew has been idling on a backwater world, watching their careers pass them by. So much for all my thoughts of James T. Kirk. Haskell layers in politics. He weaves an intriguing mystery into this and provides a protagonist with a chance to achieve a level of redemption, not just for himself, but for the whole crew and the ship. The Grimm's War series has now eclipsed Honor Harrington for me. Don't get me wrong, I still love David Weber's work. The problem is he's a little bit slow right now, and there's a lot of books out there in this Grimm's War series, so I'm now getting my fill from that. Also, and this is no offense to David Weber, but there's a lot of overburden with his brand of world building, and that's not bad, but it does kill the pace. And let's face it, military sci-fi guys, we like the action and we like the battles. Okay, Haskell navigates this past these slow pop points and really drives home a blazing, fast-paced, exciting trail through the stars. He has produced a series that transcends universe building and focuses more on well-rounded, very human characters. So for fans out there waiting for your next Weber fix, okay, I recommend you hop aboard the USS Interceptor, buckle in tight. It's going to be a bumpy ride because I'm already on book 2 and loving it. So with that, Jeffery, that was my review of the book, and I'll be posting this up in Facebook or in Amazon for you later today because I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Blaine. I think you've said everything that needs to be said. I'll catch you guys later.
Yeah, it was so much fun because it started out with this young captain, and I was like, oh my God, this is going to be so good. It's that James Kirk young guy, first command, and it was like, oh, it went to shit quick. And I loved it. It was so much fun. And the thing was, I can tell, because I know writers and stuff, I can tell you had fun writing this series. So where was your inspiration for this?
Oh boy. So a lot of places. I have wanted to write military sci-fi my whole life. When I was a kid, I dreamed about being in the military as a career. My plan was to be in the Army forever. Well, actually, my plan was to be an Air Force pilot, and then I became 6'4", and that went out the window because Tom Cruise is the right height for a pilot. And then I wanted to be in the Army. I wanted to be Special Forces, and then I was only in the Army for a couple of years, and that that didn't work out either. But I have always loved the sort of Band of Brothers story, the camaraderie, the unit, the idea that you're serving something greater than yourself. It's like a purpose, right? You're always looking for a purpose. And so my inspiration for that came from a lot of places. Obviously, you hit it with James T. Kirk. My parents were divorced when I was very young, and so I grew up watching like Kirk and John Wayne and characters like that, and they kind of became my father figure, so to speak. So those were the men, the ideal men that I was trying to live up to, And so when I set about creating characters, I wanted to create characters that people will love and like. And I don't know how many books I have passed on because the blurb started with, if you like truly deeply flawed characters, blah blah blah. And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't want to open a book with a guy sleeping with two girls or getting drunk, blackout drunk. That's a low hanging fruit flaw is what that is. I made a movie in the 1980s and I didn't know other way how to make a character seem relatable. I wanted a character whose flaws weren't generic, or the whole like he cares too much is a flaw, or I set out to make Grimm what I thought of as a naval commander, right? Not an ideal naval commander, but someone who wanted to be the ideal naval commander. I call it the Worf effect. Worf was the ideal Klingon, and the rest of the Klingons were not ideal. But
right.
He grew up thinking that Klingons were supposed to be a certain way. He acted that way. And that's how Grimm is. He grew up with the example of his spoiler alert, his mother who was killed in action. And so he was always trying to live up to her ideal. And so I wanted to make him really good at the naval commander aspect of it. And as someone who is, I'm a decent shooter. I'm decent at a lot of things, but I'm only really good at a couple of things. And unlike in movies and TV shows, you can't be good at everything. So he wasn't going to be like an amazing hand-to-hand fighter. When would we have time to learn that? He wasn't going to be an amazing shot. One of the books later on, he's in some action and he goes to shoot something that's like 10 feet away and he misses because he's shooting one-handed. And he just shakes his head and takes the appropriate stance and goes through the process in his brain, like a deep breath, sight picture, because he doesn't go down to the range. Not that they have one on the Interceptor, but he doesn't go down the range and shoot all the time or whatever. You know what I mean? That's not a naval combat commander's job. They don't get off the boat and go shoot. And so I wanted him to have, real flaws, not like the fake Hollywood or what people think of as flaws. One of the first scenes early on, he breaks his nose because he trips. He's not, he is inspired by James T. Kirk, but he's not the every man, I can do everything kind of captain. He's very good at delegating.
He was a great manager, which I really appreciated. He was a guy that, the way he handled his crew was beautiful. It was perfect because I've had to step in as a manager in my career and take over teams, and it's very much he hit the nail perfectly on the head. It was well done.
I think a lot of people think officers are these sort of like expert professionals who are better at the job than the enlisted or whatever, and that's just not the case. Officers are managers. The enlisted are the experts. And a good officer listens to his enlisted, and a good enlisted listens to his officers, because they have different jobs, different perspectives. And I think a lot of times, especially in as military sci-fi has become more action movie-esque, that is lost, like the nuance of like the different positions and different jobs and things like that. Like Grimm knows how the gravity systems work, but he couldn't fix them.
Right.
I read a great article by a World War II destroyer commander. He was an officer on the last Fletcher class destroyer in service, and he talked about how as a lieutenant they would put him in charge of engineering, or they'd put him in charge of ops, or they put him in charge of navigation, just to give him that basic experience. But it was like the chiefs that really did everything, and that impacted how I wrote the book.
I got to tell you, it was a lot of fun. And the flaw you've introduced to him with him, I don't want to ruin it for people who could read the book because I try to avoid spoilers, but it's something way beyond his control. And it's not something he did wrong.
That's the
I
best kind.
went back over and reread the chapter because I was like, where did he go wrong here? And I'm like, no, he did the right thing in the
He
right
did everything
circumstances.
right.
And
And
it
it
was
didn't
wrong.
work out. And
Yeah, it
that's
just
like
didn't
the
work
story
out.
of my Army career, so sometimes you can do everything right and things still don't work out. The trick is to turn that into something that's interesting fiction wise, because too oftentimes people will take stuff that happens in real life and they'll take the wrong lessons from it. Like, oh, it's senseless. So, okay, I'm not bagging on George Martin here because obviously he's way more successful than I'll ever be. But his whole thing is war is senseless, and so he kills people senselessly, and they die without any reason or sense of justice or anything like that. And that's his shtick, right? And sometimes that happens. But the trick when you're writing military sci-fi is you got to remember who you're writing for. Right? You're not writing for a reality-based world where, yeah, because people die in reality, and sometimes it's horrible and it makes no sense whatsoever. But that's not why you read fiction. You don't read fiction because you miss reality. You read fiction to escape from it.
And the thing was, you've really crafted something that would make an incredible comic or graphic novel easily. When I read this, I was like, you know what, this would actually be good in animation.
Oh,
It
yeah,
was
that would be awesome.
in my mind. It was like this could be a really fun story. Although Hollywood doesn't look for anything original, so they'll never happen. But I was like, this would actually be a really good animated series to watch because it's wholesome. It's very simple, and the characters are all motivated properly. They're not artificial. There's no evil scheming that's going on. You've kept it so simple. It's perfect because of that. And that's what I really liked. And that's why I draw the comparison to you against David Weber, who I respect deeply, and I'm sure you do as well.
Oh yeah, he also. I mean, like on the list of inspirations that are a mile long, he's right up there at the top.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
I've read On Basilisk Station like 19 times.
Oh, I know. He's great at character building, but he layers in so much stuff to do that. That you reach a point where it's like, look, I understand we're getting into the politics of toilet construction on this planet, and it's interesting stuff, but I don't know how that fits into the story. I want to get to the action. You kind of bypass a lot of that. You do good world building, but you do it very subtly and you do it very quickly, so that we're still in the
actually have
action.
my wife to thank for that, because she is also a writer and she has spent a number of years working on an epic fantasy that is yet to be released. And she has actually learned a lot of like craft wise from her, because she's really, really smart and she studies craft, extensively. And we talk a lot about we get along really well. So we talk a lot about craft and world building, things like that. And one of the things that we learned, and she learned, that she taught me is like, you got to wait for people to want it before you give it to them. And they don't want it until they care, and they don't care until about 2/3 of the way through the book. Like, getting them to care a little bit about a character is really important, because right in the beginning, right, you got to care a little bit to keep going. But the plot and the mystery of what's going on in the beginning is more important than the characters, because it's really difficult to make somebody really care about a character right from the beginning. You care a little bit, obviously you need to, but you transfer, like, oh, I want to know more about this mystery, and you transfer all of that to, oh, I really want to see these characters succeed. And then once people care about the characters, you could do more with the world building, which is why, like after about book 6 in the Honorverse, David really got heavy into the world building, because at that point people cared. They wanted to know more about the political structure. They wanted to know more about, sign language for the tree cats and things like that. And if they didn't, he still wouldn't be selling millions of copies of every book he writes.
Oh yeah, it just
And
slows his book production
it
down. So.
does. And also, if I'm writing as much as he's writing when I'm 74 years old, I will consider myself very successful.
Same here. I really respect the guy, is outstanding, and I never have anything bad to say about his stuff. It's just, it's nice having something to contrast against, and yours really do. It would have been easy to fall into that, and you didn't do that. You said, I'm going to tell a good story. The universe is going to happen. And that's brilliant.
And it has to happen sort of organically. I mean, obviously there's some analogies that you can make. There's no direct analogies, but almost everything in the universe is kind of drawn from the real world, real history. I'm a history buff. So there isn't anything in the world that kind of hasn't happened. Like almost every battle, every incident, every conflict is something that happened in the real world that I sort of translated into space. And for as much as people talk about how they don't want any more World War II in space books, World War II was one of the greatest in sense of scope conflicts the world has ever seen, with really complex motivations for why all the countries did what they did. My washing machine is making a bunch of noise. Is that coming through?
No.
Okay, good. So I draw a lot from history on how that all works. And, honestly, if I was as good a writer as David, I would probably do more of the world building, but the world building isn't the thing that really interests me about it. What really interests me is the characters and the technology and the ship. The Enterprise is probably my favorite ship of all time. I think I showed you, I love this ship so much. And I feel like in the last 20 years, what science fiction has gotten away from is things like ships that matter. Jacob will always be on the Interceptor, not to spoil it, but that ship's not going away. My wife did the cover art, and I always tell people, if you like the cover, you're going to like the book, because if you look at the cover, you can see the shark on the book, on the ship on the book. And that's important to me. Those details are important to me. The ship being important, the crew being important. The world building is nice, and I can do it. I'm not nearly as good as David, though, so I don't really try.
Well, I think a big piece of it is people forget that the ships or the mecha suits or whatever in sci-fi military are characters as well. And, when you look back at Star Trek, one of the things that always resonated with people is the ship was one of the central characters. And, there was something when we all saw in 1979 when they did the motion picture, and we saw that first long dragged out shot of the Enterprise. I got to be honest with you, it was like looking at an old friend, and it was something that resonated with us. So the fact that the Interceptor is the ship that Grimm's going to be on for the whole series, I'm totally comfortable with that, because it becomes a character in and of itself.
Not to mention, I wanted to be a little bit more realistic in my approach to the Navy in space. In the real Navy, in the United States wet Navy, people captain ships for years. Sometimes commanders are career commanders, and they command destroyers for their, once they hit that level, they command destroyers for their entire career. Not everybody's trying to be an admiral.
Right.
You don't necessarily need to have command of 15 different ships. I really like David, and I still read all of his books, but I miss Honor being a captain of a ship. That was the thing for me that was the big piece. It's like when they do it in Star Trek too, when they made Kirk an admiral. I mean, like what they almost immediately try to do is get him back in command of a ship, because that's what he's good at. And like you said, the Enterprise was a character in 3 when he's like, "My God, Bones, what have I done?" nobody was on board the Enterprise. It's not like he killed his entire crew. It was just the ship dying that did it. And that was probably the most emotional moment I've ever had in the cinema in my whole life, other than probably the end of Endgame.
Yeah, it was because, and people don't think about it that way. But when you look at other sci-fi genres that are out there, like, I've written for Battletech for a number of years, and people, they develop more of a bond, I think, with the mechs than they do with the characters sometimes that are in the stories that are piloting them. They're interested in those stories, and that makes it interesting. So, I mean, the fact that you've been able to kind of weave that in with this series, I think, is great.
Yeah, and all this stuff was really important to me. Like, I read in the 90s, or not 90s, in the late 80s, I read man, I thought about this before the show. Now I completely spaced his name. Mike Stackpole's Battletech series, Federated Suns.
Oh yeah.
And then when I was in the Army, I read his Rogue Squadron. All that work that he did building the Battletech universe and making that feel like a real place. That's all part of what makes me, me, and what I wanted to bring to my books. I wanted the equipment to feel real. Like me, you probably read or watched G.I. Joe in the early 80s, and all their equipment had cool names. It wasn't like, the airplane, it was the Sky Striker,
Right.
So that's where I get the Corsair. I wanted the dropship to have a cool name. I wanted the Mudcat to have a cool name. The rifles, MP-17s, the Raptor armor, the powered armor,
It's a lot of fun. I gotta tell you. Now, your interests go a little bit beyond just doing normal writing too, because this isn't your only series.
No, I started off. I have sort of an interesting route to being a full time author. I started off. I think I lost my. I gotten really sick in 2011, and I lost my job as a tech support guy. And I've always wanted to be a writer, like my whole life, but I had some disabilities I didn't realize I had at the time. I had dyslexia and ADHD, and as you can imagine, those make writing really difficult. I have a lot of things I do to cope with it. Like, I write on peak background on Word, and that helps. And I use Comic Sans, which drives my wife crazy because she's a graphics designer, and Comic Sans is not a font that anybody actually uses. Uh, and so it was really difficult for me to finish anything I started. Plus, every time I showed something that I had written to somebody, I got like, "Oh my gosh, you're horrible. You can't be a writer." But in 2011, I started going back to school, and something I'd never been good at up until that point, and then I got good at it because I was in my early 40s at the time, and I had lived a life and I was smart, and just time. And then my wife looked at me and was like, I think you have ADHD. You should get some medicine for that. And so I started taking Adderall, which made all the difference. I kind of felt like Limitless when he takes the pill and everything's in color.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, is this how people feel all the time? Because like my brother-in-law is a dentist, and he goes to work and he stays on task and he works all day long. And me, I couldn't do that. And so I started writing again, and ended up getting a freelance gig on Upwork, writing ghostwriting for somebody. And every time I finished a short story, he wanted more and more. And finally, my wife was like, "We really should just cut out the middleman here, and you should just start writing for yourself." So in 2015, I sat down to write a trilogy because I was following Chris Fox at the time, who's absolutely amazing. And if you ever get a chance to have him on your podcast, you should. He's pretty incredible. And he did this thing called a book in a month back in 2015. So I get up in the morning at 4:45. I put him on because he'd be live, and I'd write and listen to him. And I did that every day for 2015 and 2016, 5 a.m. before work, wrote for 3 hours, then went to work and went to school and stuff like that. And in in July of 2016, I won a contest called Kindle Scout, and I got my trilogy published under a pen name, and because I wrote an urban fantasy, because I didn't know, you don't know what you don't know when you first start out, and I knew that from my experience in life that the first thing I did was probably going to suck, and so I didn't want people like associating with me. And because also it was urban fantasy, if it was super successful, I wanted to be able to walk away from it if I didn't want to keep writing urban fantasy and not like have it wreck my name. And so that ended up being pretty successful, and but not successful enough that Amazon wanted to continue publishing me. And so from there, I started writing superheroes, which was something I also truly love. And so I wrote like my kind of version of Marvel comic book superheroes, so to speak, with Arsenal and the Wraith. And the Arsenal, also part of it was marketing too, because like I'd go to read a superhero book, like I read Marion G. Harmon's Wearing the Cape books, and I love them. And then I go to find something else like that, and there wasn't anything. It was all either The Watchmen, but in written form, novel form, or it was a story about somebody who lived in a universe with superheroes but didn't have superpowers and wasn't a hero or a vigilante or anything like that. And I hated both those. So I wrote my own. And so with Arsenal, it's the Full Metal Superhero. And the idea is if people wanted a superhero book, they would be able to find it because it actually says superhero in the title. And that worked. I think I sold 600 copies in the first week that Arsenal came out, which for indie is really good. I think we hit 1,100 in the store. And then each series did really well. Each successive book did really well. And around book 6, I started a new series that kind of went with it called The Wraith, Superhero by Night, which was my version of The Punisher. Basically, the tagline is if The Punisher and Batman had a baby raised by John Wick. Which, you get that reaction. I tried it at a con and everybody gave me that reaction. If you think about it, it makes no sense. But it gives you the idea of what I was going for, which was a no holds barred.
That's brilliant. It's a brilliant tagline.
Yeah, thank you. I think so too. It didn't sell as well as Arsenal, and I think that's that I learned a lot writing those books. About half of my audience from Arsenal went and read The Wraith, and the other half either didn't know it existed or didn't read it. And about half the people who read The Wraith didn't go to read, who were new, didn't go on to read Arsenal. So I learned a lot writing both those series and marketing them myself. And I had to do it without a marketing budget. I couldn't do any paid advertising because, which is a funny story in of itself. Every time I tried to do paid advertising, I would get flagged and banned from whatever advertising platform I was on. At first, I thought it was political or personal or whatever. No, it turns out that Arsenal's name is Amelia Lockhart, and I chose that name because it's reminiscent of Amelia Earhart, who she was an explorer and a pilot and all the things that I wanted to be growing up. Unfortunately, there's also a porn star whose name is Amelia Lockhart.
Oh,
and so every time I'd advertise the book, the algorithms are like, "Oh, you're advertising, adult material, banned." And so I had to do it all without any kind of advertising. And so I learned a lot. And so that's why the cover of Against All Odds is exactly what it is that, see if I can get this without a glare. You'll notice the shark on the front, which is reminiscent of the P-40s, P-41s in China, with the sort of glowing engine, that kind of reminiscent of a warp nacelle, and the sort of the battle look of the ship itself. I won't say I'm not inspired by Star Blazers because I am, and Robotech, even though I'm not really an anime fan.
You're talking to a guy who has it on DVD, so I'm a Star Blazers fan.
That was the other thing too. Is that's why they call the Long 9 a main gun, is because of the SDF-1. And so I learned all of this, and I put it all together in Against All Odds. And on top of that, I had spent like the entire 5 years prior to that building an audience on Amazon, getting followers. I think I have now that they actually released it so you can see how many followers you have. I think I have something like 17,000 followers just on Amazon. So all that kind of came together, and then Athon's brilliant advertising of the book, and voila, I got almost 5,000 reviews on the first book. It gave me financial security for the first time in my entire life. So yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your publisher. I know him because I've talked to him, but I think a lot of people don't realize there's a handful of indie publishers out there that are in the military sci-fi niche. You got Chris Kennedy Books, Tuscany. You've got Wargate.
Tuscany, is that the same people who do the comic book? The
No, I
Tuscany
don't think so.
Oh, okay.
And you got Athon.
Yeah, Wargate. Yeah, those guys are huge.
Well, that's who I go with right now. But and you've got Baen that is out there, but Baen tends to be more of the mainstream, New York publisher in terms of their approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're dealing in the indie space, there's a lot of us out there. What's it like working with your publisher? And so because a lot of people out here are looking to get their books published, should they be looking for your publisher?
Absolutely. I mean, go to athonbooks.com. Submit your book if you're interested. If you're writing military sci-fi and you feel like you've got the chops. The thing about Athon, excuse me 1 second. I'm sorry, my throat's really dry. Give me 1 sec.
Now, I will say while he's gone, you should also definitely reach out to Wargate Books because that's who's my publisher. But I want to make sure his publisher gets a fair shake here.
I appreciate that. The thing about Athon is they're looking for authors who know their stuff, right? So we all have this perception of traditional publishing being like looking for young up and coming authors, and they want to shepherd them through their career. That never happens anymore, right? I don't know if that ever existed, but it certainly doesn't exist now. Athon's not looking for someone that they can teach how to write a book. They want somebody who already knows how to write a book. And if you do know how to write a book and it's good and they pick it up, they'll advertise it. And they know about advertising. So their biggest author, he's the dumbest name, and he knows he does. But unfortunately, that was his name on Royal Road. His name is Shir DeLune, and he writes a book series called He Who Fights Monsters. He Who Fights Monsters outsells Stephen King and Harry Potter combined. Every time his book comes out, he's #1 on Amazon for a couple of weeks. I think he makes something in the neighborhood of $100,000 a day. Just ridiculous, just ridiculous sales. And he writes lit RPG, and they've got a bunch of authors like that. He's their most successful, but they got a bunch of authors like that, and it's because they know how to market them. And marketing, Red C. Bruno is the guy in charge of the business part of it, and he's just a genius marketer and a good writer in his own right. He wrote a book series called The Roach, which is being turned into a TV show on Amazon, I think. And then you got Jamie Castle, aka Steve Bollier, who is like the artistic editing side of the duo, and he's the one who picks the series a lot. And so, and then they've got a couple people who work full time for them. They're probably the biggest of the indie publishers. I think they did 250 books last year. And if you look at the list of publishers by amount of books sold, they're usually right behind Tor for books sold. They're the biggest publisher you've never heard of.
Yeah, it really, it's amazing to me in that indie space, how the indie space is selling as much as some of the larger ones. There's this perception, I think, with a lot of writers that they've got to be in bookstores and things along those lines. It's like, look, most of the people are buying their stuff on Amazon. Even when they go to the bookstore, they're looking at the book there, but they'll turn around, pull out their phone and order it on Amazon because they're getting it, shipped to their house cheap.
And it's a different audience, really. So when you're selling to traditional publishing, they're not selling to readers, they're selling to bookstores.
Yeah.
And as indies, we're selling to readers. And so cover matters way more, right? My one piece of advice to any author who wants to be successful is do not go to Fiverr or whatever discount Romanian website you're thinking about going to. Go to an established professional cover designer who knows the genre you're writing in and get a cover. If it costs $1,000, it costs $1,000. Get a cover It doesn't have to, though. You can get a great cover for a couple $100, which everybody can afford. And I'm a guy who's been dirt poor, so I know that you can afford it. It just requires some sacrifice, which is what success always requires. And get the right cover for your book, because the cover is how people buy books. You got 3 seconds to get someone to click on the book to read the blurb. And if that cover doesn't grab them in those 3 seconds, then they're not clicking on the cover and they're not going to read the blurb, and the blurb won't matter. And then what you've written won't matter because nobody will be buying.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And people don't realize it. We spend a lot of time on our covers in the indie market because you have more input and control. There's so much that's in favor of the indie market over the traditional publishers right now. That
There is, and there's some downsides too. I mean, one of the reasons why I feel like Against All Odds has kind of hit when it did is I read a lot. I mean, obviously we're authors, right? We wouldn't be authors theoretically if we didn't enjoy reading, though I've met a few. And I don't really. There are a couple of, like Rick Partlow. I really like his military sci-fi.
Oh yeah,
stuff. Drop
Rick's,
Trooper. Yeah,
Rick's
Drop
good.
Trooper. Peter Nayland's. It's not military sci-fi, but I like Peter Nayland's stuff. He nails it. I think you had him on the show at one point.
Oh yeah, his stuff.
His
Ice and Monsters was just
Oh my god, yeah.
I gotta have him on just for that one, because that one I'm doing the audio. I'm going through the audiobook on it. He and I use the same narrator, and man, it is gripping shit. I mean,
and his thriller was really good too. His Paladin. Shoot. I'm really sorry, Peter, if you're watching this. I can't think of your thriller book name, but it was really good. It came out last year, and it unfortunately got hosed by the Amazon algorithms, but it was really good. But if you want to be a traditionally published author, there's nothing wrong with that. But the choice is not between traditional and indie. The choice is between indie and not writing. You have better luck getting hit by lightning than you do being published by one of the big five. For instance, I know of an author who sells 10 times the number of books I do, and he wanted to get published by one of the big sci-fi and fantasy publishing houses. I don't want to name them because I don't want them to feel bad, because this is not against them at all. It's just, this is how it works. And they were not interested in him at all. And he thought, man, I've made $1 million a year for 3 years writing sci-fi. It's a no-brainer. They should love to publish me. No, they weren't interested. And so how they choose their books and why they choose their books has absolutely nothing to do with what people want to read or what they're reading. So if you think that you're a good writer and you want to, when you're willing to do what's required to be successful, then pretty much indie is the way to go. That just, like I said, it's not between trad and indie. It's between writing and not writing.
Well, and to me, what I've enjoyed is the lead times have been fantastic. Having written for Penguin Putnam, for example, which even had us on an accelerated timeline with their rock imprint, you're still writing the book, and then you'd wait a year before it showed up in a bookstore. And it's because they have to come up with the cover art, do all the editing, get the page count down, do the layout. Then they send a catalog to the bookstores and sell the bookstores on how many copies they're going to buy before.
And hopefully you get picked as one of the people that they want to sell, right? Because if you just unfortunately happen to be coming out the same week as James Patterson book, which is every week now, you might be like, well, we'll take 3 copies. And then if you sell 1 copy, they won't order anymore. So it's a little frustrating, and for indies, there's sort of the same problem, which is discoverability is getting discovered, but that's why the cover is so important. That's why the title is so important. That's why the blurb is so important. These are things that you spend money on, and it doesn't have to cost a lot, but it has to be good if you want to succeed.
Yeah, it does. And your wife does covers, correct?
Yeah, vividcovers.com is her cover business. She's been doing it for, I think, since 2011 now. And so She didn't start with my covers. She's been a professional artist her whole life. She did 3D art content for The Sims going back years, and obviously graphic design and all that kind of stuff. And so when she started doing covers, and when I started writing, it kind of was a no-brainer to have her do my covers. And she's a genius, so they turned out really well. Now she does covers for like Craig Martell's Leviathan series is her work. She's done a bunch of stuff for Aethon. They love her, so they're constantly hiring her to do their work. And when I got picked up by Aethon, I had to pitch them my book series, and which is an interesting story. They asked me to change a few things, and up until that point, I'd never been asked to change anything in my books. And so that was like,
it's an interesting experience.
It is, right? Because at first you think, well, I'm willing to do anything I need to do to succeed. And then someone's like, oh, hey, I need you to change this thing about your book that is like the core of the book. And you're like, I don't know if I can do that. But ultimately I did. And it was for the best. They know what they're talking about when they tell you, hey, we want this or we want that. They know exactly what they're doing. So they're worth listening to. And so when they picked me up, I was like, listen, part of the deal here is either Rebecca does my covers or Tom Edwards does my covers. That's those are the options, and they do a lot with Tom, but they were happy to write it in the contract that Becky did my covers. So
cool. But and your daughter's a talented artist too.
Yes, my whole family is filled with talent. My son's he's working on a video game design course. He's building a video game, and my youngest daughters are amazing as well. So like my whole family is filled with talent, and like I have this one thing I can do, right? I can write, and I'm not even really that great at it. I'm good at the storytelling aspect of it.
No, you're pretty good at it. Okay, I gotta be honest with you. I got hooked on this series.
Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed it. But I mean, like if you objectively look at the writing part of it, it's like the writing is okay. The story, I'm a good storyteller. Storytelling is fantastic. My wife, man, she can write words that make you cry, and it's just anyways. But my daughter wants to be a comic book artist, and she's been drawing every day for her whole life. She's 20, so that's not super long. But a couple years ago, I was like, hey, listen, honey, if you really want to do this, then you need to do what I did when I wanted to be a writer, which means you need to start getting up every day. You need to treat it like a job. You need to do it 4 or 5 hours a day. You need to do it with focus. You need to do it with an eye toward improving. And so she did, and blew me away, because honestly, I didn't know if she was going to be able to do that or not. And it totally blew me away. And she got so good so fast, to the point where I showed Ethan Van Sciver some of her work, and he couldn't believe that she was 19 at the time and had drawn that. And then Mike Barron was the same way. He saw our art and he's like, oh my gosh, that's really good. You guys are gonna do well. So we're turning the Wraith into a comic book at some point. We've got an amazing cover artist, John Giago. I don't know how to say his name.
I don't.
Giago. He did the cover for the Last Ronin TMNT comic book, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Last Ronin.
Oh yeah, my grandson's we just got it, the Last Ronin graphic novel for his birthday.
Yeah, he did the cover for that one, and he's absolutely awesome. He's going to be doing the cover art for the Wraith, and we'll kickstart at some point, hopefully before the end of the year. It just depends. She's still,
you got to keep me in the loop, because we'll have you on when that happens.
Oh yeah,
so you
love
can
to,
do the plug.
She's still it's funny watching her go through the process of learning how to draw a comic book, which is very similar to the process of learning how to draw a novel. You can read all you want about, or write a novel. You can read all you want about writing a book, and you can talk to people about writing a book. But until you actually write a book, you don't know how you write a book.
Right.
And so I always tell people, your first book's the hardest one, because you don't know how to write a book yet. But once you finish that book, that part of it, like the learning how to write a book, gets easier. Like, I don't think it ever actually gets easy, but at least for me anyways. But the actual finishing that first book is really important. And so she's going through that process right now with comic books. So it's kind of fun to watch.
My daughter co-authors true crime books with me, and it's been a real experience as a writer having a co-author, who's my daughter. You would think it's totally changed our dynamic, because now we're equals. We're both putting our names on it. first one we did hit the New York Times bestseller list for Crime and Punishment. So it was like, crap, we actually do this well together, but we had to figure out
Right on.
how to write together. And then,
which can be difficult. Yeah.
It's a real challenge. And fortunately, her style is very similar to mine, which makes me wonder how much of it is genetic versus learned. Which is fascinating all on its own. But it's really kind of interesting how.
Well, it is really interesting because, like, I read the first 5 books of Drop Trooper.
Oh yeah!
And
God, I love that series.
Rick and I are good friends. We talk often, but we don't really talk about like the world building that goes into our books and anything. And he did a lot of stuff that I did, and vice versa. And Drop Trooper came out 2 years before Against All Odds, but I didn't read it until last year. And I was just like, Rick, you did this thing here. Why did you do that? And he's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, I did the same thing. And Rick is 51 or 52, and I'm 50. So we grew up watching the same things. We grew up listening to the same things, reading the same books. So it stands to reason that we're going to have similarities unconsciously, just because that's the tree that we're drawing from. And so, you mentioned the thing about like how much is it genetic. When our kids are kind of the same way, right? We impart our views and our love of cinema and music and books and whatever on our kids, and so of course they're going to be similar, just a little different, hopefully.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff. Well, look, we've had you on for a long time here. How can people connect with you? What's the best way for them to go to you? Do you have a website? Do you prefer Facebook or Twitter?
I do have a website, jeffreyhaskell.com. And I wish I updated it more, but you can sign up for a mailing list there, or you can go on Amazon and click the follow button. I've just typed Jeffery H. Haskell. I'm the only one who's an author. Unfortunately, I was still learning when I named my book, and my Steve Ballier, Jimmy Castle, the editor at Athon, did a little joke, and he put the movie Against All Odds, but with my font and stuff on the cover and sent it to me. And he's like, "Are you sure you want that as the name?" And at that point, it was too late to change it. And it fit really well, but there's like a million Against All Odds. So if you put in Jeffery H. Haskell, ERY H. Haskell, you'll get all my stuff, and you just click follow, and Amazon will notify you whenever. Or you come on Facebook, facebook.com, just type in Jeffery H. Haskell. I've got a business page that I don't really check so much anymore, so you can just follow me on my personal page. A fan, Danny Cannon, I think he's actually on here, started a group called Haskell's Heroes. You can join if you want to learn more about the book series, and it's just Facebook Haskell Heroes. So
cool. Yeah. Well, Watcher, do we have any questions that have popped up or comments from folks out there? And I've seen a couple where people are like, I went out and bought the book. This is a good one.
So we'll start with here.
Absolutely. There's a guy named David Sherrier who does game design, and he did a really popular game this year called Cat Magic. We tried to get it nominated for a Dragon, but he missed by like that much, I think. He said that a collectible card game based on it would be probably a pretty big deal. I would love to do a miniature game, but yeah, no. Anybody out there who game company and they want to talk about doing a game for it, I'm game. As for doing it myself, I just don't have the time. I've got 5 kids, and I have a part-time job I do for the benefits. I just don't have the time for anything other than the writing.
This is a good one. What's the name of the energy field that surrounds the interceptor? Okay,
so I love science. And so when people say follow the science and it's not actual science that they're following, it pisses me off. I follow actual science, and I read a lot of papers, science papers, stuff like that. While the gravity coil that the interceptor uses is complete science fiction. I mean, there's no the idea of a gravity manifold that moves you through space faster absolutely is based on reality. And so the grav coil creates a gravity field around the interceptor, right? And that gravity moves front to back. And so what happens is basically it's pulling the interceptor through space around space-time. And that's what that field is. So if you shoot something at interceptor at a 45-degree angle, it's most likely going to deflect off because that's the direction gravity is going, right? So it's not like David Weber's gravity drive that he uses, where they have the gravity bands that are impenetrable, stuff like that, the impellers and things like that. They don't really have force fields. They just have this they have a more G's around them that deflect things. But, shots that impact directly from a 90-degree angle almost always go right through and, hit the ship. So the grav coil creates a grav field that is what moves the ship. And the reason why the ship has two gravity coils is one moves the ship and one keeps everybody alive. Because just because you are moving with a gravity field doesn't mean that you don't feel the effects of acceleration. And so the secondary grav coil, as they call it, is what keeps everybody, down and alive. Which is also why they, obviously, I'm a huge fan of things like Run Silent, Run Deep, or maybe not. Obviously, I don't know. I love World War II movies, some movies, and specifically, and Audie Murphy and stuff like that. And so, one of the things I always loved in some movies is, the move. There's momentum. Like when they go down, they go up, they go left and right. Obviously, that doesn't matter in space. So my challenge was creating a realistic propulsion system that would sort of mimic that. And that's what happens is you got the primary grav field with the center of gravity in the back and the secondary grav field that holds them down. And so when they turn or they go up or down, there's two forces of gravity on them, one pushing down and one pushing back. And that's why you end up with them having to hold on.
What's the thought about keeping the technology realistic?
Well, that one was interesting because the idea with technology is I wanted something that was like, I love science, but I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. If I didn't understand it, the reader wouldn't understand it. And so I tried to keep it in the realm of possibility, but advanced enough that people would think like, oh, okay, like this is something that could happen. But then I set it 1,000 years in the future, so I didn't have to worry about, a timeline of the future, like what happened in 2333 or whatever. There's some reference to it, but for the most part, it's up to your imagination to know what happened. And so by keeping it realistic and keeping it in a realm that people were easy to understand, it's kind of like a magic system. If people can't understand the technology, then you can't base the plot on any technology, because you have to understand what's happening in order to understand, understand the plot in the book and stuff like that. So the technology is all stuff that people can understand, even if it means that it's maybe not as advanced as it probably would be in 1,000 years. Also, keeping everything based on real science is important to me, because all the great science fiction I grew up reading was based on real science, like The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelli. That was an impactful book to me, and it was amazing. Obviously, there are some liberties I take because they have FTL with the star lanes, but even that is sort of based on my reading of how gravity works and how gravity manifolds work, and how the interaction between star systems and the galactic plane and stuff like that operate. So even though it's like the actual way the technology works, the theory behind it is sound. So that's kind of what I try to go for, which is why they have coil guns for the Alliance and plasma launchers, phase plasma launchers for the Caliphate, and the Iron Empire uses projectile weapons, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, what I liked is you didn't fall into the pitfalls that Star Trek fell into in later years, which is the technology became the dominant driver for storylines, and you kept it more like the Orville, where we go faster than light, and that's all you need to know.
And if it becomes important to the plot, like how it operates, absolutely, it will become, I'll explain more of it. Spoiler alert, there's a anomaly that appears at one point that they travel through. It's completely based on real science. I did a bunch of research to figure out exactly what it would look like, how it would appear, all that good stuff. And it's explained in the book as it is explained to Jacob. So that was one of the big things too that coming into this in writing science fiction is I feel like at some point in the last 30 years, all the wonder was lost. I remember watching this episode of Enterprise where they come to the star system and there's never before seen stellar phenomenon and they're like sipping coffee.
Yeah.
Oh, how interesting. And I think at one point in book 2, they're on the bridge looking at something and Jacob's like, if somebody doesn't explain this to me, people are getting shot, because they're seeing something that shouldn't be possible, but it is. And sometimes you're going to be reading stuff in this book. Like I had a physics teacher message me. He's like, "Hey man, I love your books. They're really great, but you got this thing wrong." And I'm like, "I didn't get it wrong. NASA got it wrong." And I sent him the paper that I had drawn it from. And he's like, "Holy crap, I've been teaching physics for 18 years. How did you know this and I didn't?" And I'm just like, I read a lot, and science is important to me, especially the science of space travel, because I spent so much of my youth dreaming about going to the planets and being in space and getting away from my childhood.
So what's your next project that's coming out? I mean, you're always probably working on a couple books in the pipeline. What's the next thing that's coming out publish-wise?
Group 6 comes out on September 12th, so this podcast is great timing. It's been particularly difficult because this has been a difficult year. We moved states. We moved for the first time in 14 years, so it's been a challenge. My son was in the hospital earlier this year, unfortunately, and so it's been an adventure. When we're done here, I'm going to be writing for the rest of the day, probably. I try to write 3,000 to 4,000 words a day, and that hasn't been happening pretty much since January. And so it needs to happen now because the book is almost due and I'm not done with it. After that will probably be Grimm 7. I do have a project, kind of a passion project I'm working on. My publisher doesn't want me to do it next, so I won't be doing it next. He wants me to focus on military sci-fi, which makes 100% sense, right? And it is military. It's just not military sci-fi. It's more military fantasy. It's F-14s and dragons is what I'm going to say about that. I love F-14s. They're just the greatest to me in my mind. Maybe because of Top Gun.
It's Top Gun.
Or I read a bunch of books by this Navy aviator years ago about a F-14 pilot named Tombstone. I played DCS. I've got the F-14 in DCS, and so it's a great plane. It's iconic, is what it is. And Skull Squadron from Robotech. So my idea is to take the USS Enterprise from like 1987, and they go through like a portal to a fantasy world, and they got to fight dragons and demons and things like that. And it's about an F-14. The aviator, F-14 aviator is the main character, but there's Marines and stuff like that. It's a work in progress, but for
you're a victim of your own success.
I am, and that's something
you're writing military sci-fi. They're going to lock you into that.
Yeah, they don't talk a lot about that as authors. It's like what happens when you have a series that's successful. I know Rick's been battling that with Drop Trooper. I think they just finally announced the last Drop Trooper is coming out. I think 16 is going to be the last one. And when you have a series that's successful, you do not jump off that horse and go write something else, no matter how much you want to. And not that I want to stop writing Grimm 6, but like I still have another Wraith book I have to write. I actually have a contract with Tantor Media for it, and they've been really great about they're like whenever, but it's been 2020 was the last Wraith book I released, and here it is 2023 and almost 2024, and I haven't even started that one. Because these novels are, they're 120,000 words long, where my superhero novels are 60, and they require a level of excellence beyond that. I mean, multiple POVs, or third person. There's technology, there's research, there's cultures, there's historical references. Everything, no matter how unbelievable, no matter how crazy you think it is that happens in Grimm's War, is something that happened in history that I picked out. I think you said you were reading book 2.
Yeah.
The Guild is based off the East Indian Trade Company, and so and the stuff that they did, and so everything that the Guild did is stuff that the East Indian Trade Company was did. The Caliphate is kind of obvious. I based it off a 13th century caliphate that actually existed, which is funny because somebody said, like, it's obvious that Against All Odds is an analogy for the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I'm like, yeah, I wrote this book in 2020, 2 years before that war happened. So I don't know how that's possible. But if you look at Russian history, you'll see a lot of situations where, like, there were parts of the country that basically became their own little empire. And that's kind of what Zuckerbar is. It's like it's this one guy's own little empire.
Yeah.
Like that. So.
I gotta tell you, your stuff is so solid. This has been a real treat. Folks, it's been over an hour here, so we're probably gonna wrap up. Jeffery Haskell, the book that I started with, Against All Odds, it's book 1 in the series. I recommend you pick it up if you haven't already. It's a great read. The pace, you're going to go blow through this book quick. It's got such a quick flow to the narrative and stuff. It's so well done. You're really going to enjoy it. Jeffery, thanks so much for coming on. When you're getting ready to push out your comic book Kickstarter, let's get you back on, because a lot of our guys read comics too. So
we'll do. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Blaine. It's been a real treat. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Watcher, anything else other than remind people to let's make sure you click on the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Follow us.
Smash the like button.
There's that. But so I told you guys that we're going to try and announce who we're having on next week beforehand. Ooh. Blaine, why don't you go ahead and give them a taste?
We're going to have the editor of this magazine, the Anvil, which is the Iron Age magazine. For those of you who don't know, Razor Fist kind of coined the phrase that we're in the Iron Age of independent writers. It kind of came out of the Comicsgate debacle, etc. And there's a magazine out now that's dedicated to the Iron Age, and we're going to talk with the editor of it and talk a little bit about where they've gone and where they're going, because they're getting ready to do issue 2. And they're already planning out issue 3. So it's a great thing for the indie writer movement out there, be it in comics or in literature. So it's going to be a lot of fun next week.
All right. Perfect. We hope to see you guys next week. And as Scott would say, stay safe.